We are still in our series that we're calling Emptied. And I have to say, I was wrestling with my family today. They told me that this shirt isn't green enough. And so I'm going to start a new YouTube controversy, right? You remember the dress that was gold or blue? And you remember, what was it, Yancey or Laurel, right? So we're starting a new one today. So when we post this video online later today or tomorrow, you can get into the comment section and you can tell me just how blue or how green this shirt is. And we're just going to take YouTube by firestorm, right? So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to lose. Am I? We'll see, because I might just comment 100 times, Donna. Who knows? So remember the Life Rally, seriously? Remember the Life Rally today at 2? It looks like they've enlarged their space, so hopefully we can get about 100 or so inside their building. But this is such an important time in our nation's history. And so if we have to stand out in the cold, I will give up my seat to you if you need to be inside, and I'll stand out in the cold. I don't care. I just want to stand on the side of Jesus, the side of life. This is an easy way to do it. So come at 2 on the corner of Bond and Stitt. So you're heading towards Friarmood, you're heading towards my house, and before you get there, just stop when you see the Life Center sign, and you'll see it right on the corner of Bond and Stitt Street. So last week, like I said, we jumped into this series that we're calling Emptied, and we're taking time through this season in the church that we call Lent, and it's similar to the Advent season that leads up to Christmas. Lent is a season that leads up to Easter, and a lot of times in our church, in our denomination, we don't really emphasize this season so much, but really it's this time where we focus in on Jesus, and we remember his great sacrifice for us as we kind of make our way to Easter when he poured out, or he emptied his life to save us. Now last week I shared with you out of the Bible, one of the oldest worship songs that we have actually recorded for us. And it's found in Philippians chapter 2. And it's all about telling us about Jesus humbling himself. And it says that he made himself nothing. And in the original language, it literally says that he emptied himself, or he poured himself out, you could say. Right? And it's the sentence before that song that Paul, the author, writes that I really want us to kind of focus on over these different weeks. And it simply says this: your mindset or your attitude needs to be the same as that of Christ Jesus. And so just as he emptied himself, so too we have things in our lives that we need to empty ourselves. Now here's the difference, right? Jesus, when he emptied himself, I like how the hymn we just sang put it. He emptied himself of all but love, right? And so he set aside his glory, and he set aside his power, and he set aside his majesty as he made his way to us. Now, our emptying is just a little bit different, because we're pouring things out of our lives that tend to block us from growing in this life with Jesus, right? And so while he set aside his glory and majesty, we're setting aside things that maybe are unhealthy for us, things that are blocking us from this life with him, right? Things that we can pour out of our lives so that God can now fill us in this greater way. And so that's kind of what we're journeying and what we're doing. Now, last week we talked about pouring out our doubts, especially about God and this relationship with him when we're running through empty times in life, these really low times, these difficult moments. Today I want us to talk about this area of brokenness that we face and how God moves to face this with us. Okay? Now, I don't know about you, but in my home, there are a lot of broken things. Anybody relate to that? You got broken things in your home, right? Okay. Now, I've learned that in just about every family, there's at least one who we would call the fixer, right? Now, that's kind of like my official title, right? This is the person in the family that restores what's broken, or at least attempts to restore what's broken. Sometimes that's where I kind of fall, is more in the attempt than the actual fixing. But in my family, I have this kind of official title. I am Dad, the fixer of broken stuff. Right, that's kind of like my long title, and I don't have a name tag for that yet, although I think the girls will probably make one for me. Now, most of the time, that happens to be with like toys, and I've become really great at fixing dolls with a little bit of fishing string and a whole lot of super glue, okay? And I love that feeling that you get when you tackle a project, something that's broken, and you're able to transform this thing and bring it back, and it's restored, and you can step back. And isn't that a great feeling when you're able to fix something like that? Now, there are other times when I find myself in over my head. In fact, the majority of the time, I think that's really where I find myself. And sometimes fixing what is broken, it just takes a lot longer than I anticipated. I've got a bathroom project that's taken me 2 years longer than I thought it would to fix. Every time I try to fix it, something else in the bathroom falls apart, right? You kind of have one of those types of deals. Sometimes it's just too broken, whatever you're working on, and so you just can't fix it. And so in the garbage it goes, right? Because you've given it all you can do. You just can't bring this back. Just throw it away. Sometimes, I got to say, I just get overwhelmed by the amount of brokenness all around me, especially when in my house, it's my dresser in my bedroom. That's what the landing platform is for a lot of the stuff that the girls have that's broken, right? And so that tends to get piled up. That's like the OR waiting area for the super glue surgery that's about to take place. And so a lot of times that'll just get piled high with different things. And sometimes I just feel overwhelmed by all the broken. And I have to say, I don't think we ever have to look far to see broken. And I think that you get that when I say that, that statement goes beyond home repair, beyond the fixing of stuff. We don't have to look far to see broken. We see it in our world. I think we were reminded of it again this week as you flip on the news and you see this horrific mass shooting in New Zealand. It's horrible. And so we've got families that are ripped up and shattered, broken, all because of a broken man going on a rampage. We see it in our own nation, right? We don't have to look to New Zealand. We see it here in America. Every day we see it with political figures and the infighting and the name-calling and the verbal attacks against one side or another. And that divisiveness just bleeds over into the rest of society, doesn't it? And so now it's hard to get onto Facebook or Twitter and you don't see people just ripping at one another. Sometimes it's not even on social media. It's just face-to-face now. It's like we don't even have a filter sometimes. We just see a lot of brokenness in America. But I think we don't even just have to say, well, it's out there. I think we could really just bring it home. Because brokenness is something that we all face. We all wrestle with this. And the evidence is really all around us. You know, we've talked about the stats before about depression and anxiety and how that's just off the charts anymore. It's just on the rise throughout America, throughout our families. Our kids and our teens today, the number one issue that they face over and over and over again is self-esteem problems, right? They're searching for worth. They're searching for their value. And so often they're searching in all of these unhealthy areas to try to find that in their life. Or we could look at the massive increase in addiction, and especially the rampant rise of overdosing that just is plaguing even our community here in Wabash, right? Brokenness is all around us, and people are trying to self-medicate the pain away through all sorts of different addictions in their lives. Now, sometimes brokenness, we face it because life moves in just brutal ways, right? And it just rips us up. And so we face things like abuse, or we face things like neglect, or we face things like abandonment, maybe as a child, maybe in a relationship, or maybe it's sudden loss that just rips apart our lives, or maybe some other massive event that just leaves us staggering, right? And so when tragedy hits like that, we get it. We're like, oh yeah, I can see why brokenness is in me, or why that person is so broken, because I can see what happened to their life. Sometimes it's not a massive deal, though. Sometimes it's the proverbial death by 1,000 cuts. And so it's the constant criticism we receive where we feel like, man, I can never measure up. Or it's the harmful comments or the lies that are told to us about our worth. And we start to believe them. They just kind of stick. These labels stick on us, and it's hard to get them off. We just have a hard time, I think, sometimes letting go of really negative voices in our lives. And maybe they're speaking into us today. Maybe it's from our past. But every cut, every dig just leaves these little rips and tears and scars that time just doesn't seem to heal. And if you somehow escape the big tragedies, and if you somehow escape the death from 1,000 cuts, sin is going to get you in the end. Sin in us, sin in this world, always has a way of just ripping us up. To one extent or another, all of us face broken. I think we just have to begin there and just admit that truth, right? And so one of the big questions, though, that we wrestle with is this: what does God do with broken people? Right? And really what we're wrestling with is this: what's the dividing line between brokenness that he can fix and broken that is thrown out? I think broken's a good word to describe a woman that Jesus once encountered. We find her story in Luke chapter 13. If you have your Bibles, that's where we're just going to hang out for most of today, beginning in verse 10. And this is what we read there. So there's a Sabbath. Jesus goes into the synagogue, and he was teaching there. And it says there was a woman who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. And so she was bent over and could not straighten up at all. I just pause there. Now, I know that when we read this, it sounds pretty normal at first glance, right? It's not unusual to read about Jesus and see him encountering someone who is struggling. What is strange is that Luke, the author of this gospel, the one who's writing this moment about Jesus to share it with us, what's unusual is how he describes this woman. Now, if you know anything about Luke at all, then you know that before he hooked in with the Apostle Paul, is where we first encounter him, that he was a doctor. Now, he also continues to be a doctor, but then he also takes up writing, in his spare time as he's on these missionary journeys, and he's writing to different people, and he writes Acts, and he also writes the Gospel of Luke, okay? So he's a doctor. Just about every time that there's a physical problem that Jesus addresses in the Gospel of Luke, or even in the book of Acts, Luke, the doctor, describes the disease. That's what a doctor kind of does. He's got a doctor mind. And so he's going to talk about it being blindness, and he's going to talk about it being muteness, and he's going to talk about the leprosy. And sometimes he even goes into the detail, right? Scales are falling from people's eyes, all sorts of things. He's listing out the medical issue that's going on as a doctor would do. He doesn't do that here. Now, he tells us that this woman she's bent. He tells us that much, but he doesn't say that it's a problem with her back. He doesn't say, she was bent and it's because of a spinal disorder. It's because of, what we would call osteoporosis. They had their own word. He doesn't describe it like that. That's what you would expect. Instead, he says, she was bent because of a spirit. Literally, in the original language, it says she was bent because of a spirit of weakness. A spirit of weakness. And so instead of just tying this to just a medical problem, Luke shows us there's more going on here. She wasn't just bent physically, she was broken spiritually. You tracking? In fact, as he goes on to describe this woman, he tells us she could not straighten up. Again, that's a key phrase. It's hard for us to see this, but in the original language, he uses the exact same words as he uses to describe John the Baptist. And John, he was talking one day about Jesus, and he says, there's someone greater than me, and I am so unworthy to be in his presence. I'm not even worthy enough to untie his sandals. It's that word unworthy. That's how Luke describes this woman. She was bent, she's broken, and she feels absolutely unworthy and useless. Bent, broken, useless. That's what she felt. That's where she was. And I think most of us have been there. To one extent or another, because life has a way of moving in ways that leave us bent out of shape, broken, and feeling useless. We all face broken. And when we do, man, one of those big questions that is just on our mind is, what does God do with broken people? Now, what I love is that in this moment, Jesus answers this for us. He shows us what God longs to do with broken people like you and like me. And so I just want us to just open this up, this moment, okay, and get into this. So, we've got a woman. She has been bent and broken for 18 years. She shows up to church. That's what they're doing here, right? She's looking for God. Not so sure at this point that God's looking for her. She doesn't stand out to anyone. I mean, she's just part of the crowd. No one that day saw her, really. She'd been coming to church for years. They were used to seeing her in her brokenness. It was normal. But she did stand out to Jesus. In fact, here's just the first part of the very next verse, verse 12. When Jesus saw her, I just pause there for a moment. Because this looks like a really small thing, but I got to tell you, this is actually a really big thing. Because the truth is that this is the first thing Jesus shows us about how God deals with broken people. And it's this truth, right? He sees us in our brokenness. God sees us in our brokenness. Now, this is huge. Because we often don't see the brokenness around us. There is so much of it in our world. It is so easy to just get used to seeing the broken so that broken becomes normal. And I just kind of walk through with blinders on in this world. But Jesus, He isn't blinded by the overwhelming brokenness around us. He sees our brokenness. He sees your struggles. He sees your wounds. He sees your scars. And now to some of us, that is such a relief. Right? Because we believe that if Jesus sees us, if He sees our brokenness, well, now He can move to restore. Now, for others, it's a bit of a different story. Because sometimes all we see is our brokenness. And we become ashamed of it. Right? We feel like Quasimodo, just kind of making our way through life. And we hope that other people don't see how broken we are. In fact, we try to hide it from other people. And we really hope that Jesus will just overlook it, not see it. Because to us, broken means a loss of potential. And we know that in this world, it's often the broken things that get tossed out into the garbage. They're useless, right? And so to hear that Jesus sees us in our brokenness makes some people very uneasy. We'd much prefer to have Jesus see us at our best. Look at me now, Jesus, not when I'm broken. But here's the deal about God. Can I just share this with you? Many times broken is exactly what He uses to show off His potential, His glory. I want you to think about this. Jesus used broken bread to feed over 5,000 people. It was a broken alabaster jar of perfume brought out by Mary to anoint Jesus that absolutely transformed the environment of the room that night as she anoints Him before His death. It's the very broken body of our Savior Jesus on the cross that God used to save all of us. And He tells us that it's a broken heart in us that He's able to use and work with to redeem and restore. God sees us in our brokenness. He's not unaware. He's not oblivious of what you're going through. He sees you. He knows what you're facing. And best of all, man, it drives him. He is moved to help you. He's moved by your brokenness. Because when Jesus sees broken, what he really sees is potential. He sees potential. And really that truth alone has the capacity to just transform your life if you can latch on to that. Because when Jesus sees us, man, there is hope. Because now there's the potential for change. You with me? All right. That brings us to the next truth that Jesus shows us here. So, again, let's just get back into this moment. There's this woman, she's bent physically, she's broken spiritually. She's been this way for 18 years. She shows up to church. She's looking for God. Not so sure that he's looking for her. And again, we get to verse 12. And Jesus saw her bent and broken, and he called her forward. So here's the next truth that we see about what God does with broken people. He calls us out of our brokenness. He doesn't just see us in it, now he's calling us out of it. Now in this moment, this woman had a choice. She could respond to the call, or she could stay where she was. Right? Now, have you ever noticed how people respond differently to different calls? Let me just give you a couple of examples. You remember back when you were in school and you got called to the principal's office? Most of us are not too excited about that trip. In fact, it's kind of this slow, walk of shame as the teacher escorts you, or the hall monitor, these pint-sized prison guards, as they take you to the principal's office, right? And even today, at your work, when the boss calls you into the office, you kind of like sink back into principal mode, don't you? Right? You just wonder what bad news or correction or punishment you're going to receive when you get this kind of call. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, from the principal call, I think we could put this. There's the Price is Right call. Right? Yeah. Now, we got to see this, didn't we, Andy and Randy? We got to see this. Janet was there, too, about a year ago when they had the live show here at the Honeywell. It was amazing. And talk about responding differently. We stood in line for 40 minutes to register for a chance to be called. I've never stood in line to get into the principal's office. And when the names were called, there was no hesitation. There's no walk of shame. But I mean, they're jumping and they're celebrating and they're shouting as they hear those words, "Come on down," right? And there's excitement as people are running forward. So here's the question. Which way do you respond when Jesus calls you? Several years ago, a group of pastors I knew, they were able to go to Cali, Colombia. And I've shared with you before that in Cali, Colombia is the largest Church of the Nazarene in the entire world. Every weekend, between 20 and 30,000 people gather together in multiple services just for their weekend gathering, right? Throughout the week, they have home groups where like over 90% of those same people gather every day at one place or another. Throughout the week, people are gathering every day for these prayer cells, Bible studies, things like that. They shared their experience. They were able to go to one of these massive worship services. He said that at the end, there was this part that caught my attention. He said, at the end of the service, the pastor, they said, always gives this invitation to come to Jesus. He gives this call forward to receive Jesus. And people begin to move out from their chairs towards the altar at the front of their church. Now, as those people get up and leave and start making their way forward, responding to the call, the rest of the people in the church, man, they start clapping and they start cheering and they start praising God as they whip into a big worship song, right? Because they know who's calling. And they know what He wants to do in this person's life. And so they don't want this person to respond to Jesus with like a principle type of walk. They want them to know this is the most wonderful thing that is taking place in your life. He's calling you forward. Do you see this? Right? Apostle Peter puts it this way. If we could just flip over to his letter, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. It says, but you are a chosen people. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You are God's special possession. Right? Prized shelf is where He's putting us. So that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness and into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, just orphans. But now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you're living in it. Right? The truth is that when Jesus calls us, man, it is never in a way that just points out our brokenness to shame us. That's not His intent. But He does call us. He calls us out of hiding and into the light. He calls us out of believing that broken is normal and this is where I'm stuck forever, and into the truth that healing is possible. He calls us out of where we are, complacent, stuck, blocked from growing, and into where we're now moving in life with Him. He calls us out of our shame, out of the pain of our past, out of our sin, and into this new life with Him. And every time He calls us, it's always in this public way. It's always in front of other people. Now, it's not to shame us. It's so that everyone else will absolutely know that He is not ashamed of you. He's called you. He's chosen you. And so He wants everyone to see that. You see that now? And it's also because He wants all of us to celebrate again. So He calls us publicly so that we can celebrate together just how awesome He is. Right? So this is why we still believe in having what we call an altar at the front of the church, and why at the end of every service we give an invitation for people to draw close to Jesus, or why in the middle during our prayer time we say, come on down. He's calling you, right? Because we know He's absolutely not ashamed of you. And when we see Him speaking to one of us, we remember how He's chosen and called all of us. Isn't that good? He's the God who calls us out of our brokenness. I love that. Now that leads us into the last truth I want us to look at today, that Jesus shows us about what God does with broken people. So let's just get back into this passage in Luke again. So when Jesus saw her in her brokenness, He called her forward out of her brokenness. And He said to her, woman, you are set free from your infirmity. And then He placed His hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Don't you love this? Right? And so here's the last part of what Jesus shows us here that we're looking at today, that God heals us of our brokenness. Now again, it's interesting the wording Jesus uses to heal this woman. Because He doesn't come to her, He doesn't just place His hands on her and say, stand up straight. Behold, your spine is made well. Right? He doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus says, you are set free from your infirmity. Now, again, I know we've got to do some language study here, but that word infirmity is what we just translated as weakness in that phrase, spirit of weakness. And I think it's important for us to see what Jesus is doing here. Because when He looks at this woman, it's deeper than just her physical bent issue that He sees. He looks past and beyond the fact that she was bent to the truth that she's broken inside. And He says to this woman, this weakness of yours, this spiritual brokenness that has trapped you for 18 years, you're set free from that. And the truth is that Jesus still moves to heal us today. And I just really believe that he's speaking to some of us even in this room. That this inner wound, this scar that has held you back and held you down for so long, this pain from your past that cripples you from getting close to other people, that kind of stifles you from growing in God, this shame that you've carried that just makes you feel so unworthy of love and forgiveness, this deal that has held power over your life, that has bound you. Jesus says you're set free from that. Can you hear him today? Now here's the part that I really love. I love all of it, but it just keeps getting better and better for me as I make my way through this. Because Jesus speaks and frees this woman of her brokenness before he touches her. Did you notice that? I love that he touches her and she is able to stand up straight. Right? Her bent body is restored. I love that. The greater truth is that he's moving beyond the problem of her back to bring healing and restoration to the brokenness inside. Right? We've been touching on that. You seeing that? Now we often long for Jesus to just move on the surface. Jesus, would you just change my situation? Would you just bring the physical healing? Would you just magically somehow make things better in my marriage? Would you bring that job transfer that I've been praying for? Would you just somehow remove the scars that keep us feeling bent and broken and useless? Okay, but here's the deal with God. He always moves deeper than that. He reaches beneath the surface, if we could put it that way, to touch our spirit. To remind us that your worth is not dependent upon your circumstances. It's not based on your struggles. It's not dependent upon the scars that you have from living life in this world. Your worth is defined by him. And so he lifts up our head to remind us, you are my child, and that's what matters. Now, sometimes he does transform our situations and he touches us physically and he removes those scars. And like the woman that day, we just stand and we praise God because he is so awesome and he is worthy of praise. But other times, God moves differently as he does this work inside of us. And you know what? He still sets us free. He heals us of the brokenness inside, but he doesn't maybe change the situation that we're in, the situation that we're facing. Instead, he pours out this overabundance of grace into our lives that we already were hearing testified about today. He gives us this incredible promise. My grace is sufficient for you. It's more than enough. More than enough. For my power is made perfect. In other words, it works best in weakness. And so sometimes God moves in this way as he just pours out his grace to keep you. And more than that, his grace just flows out in this overabundance. So now it's flowing from you out of the very scars and moments in your life that used to hold you down. God does the miraculous here. Do you see this? These moments that you're like, God, would you just take these away? These moments now become the very points in life that God uses for you to help others experience his grace. As you come alongside of them and you're like, you know what? Man, I get it. I know how you feel. I have so been there. But there is a God who longs to heal and who wants to restore you. He sees you. Man, he's calling you out of your brokenness. He's just waiting for you to just turn to him and give him your brokenness. You see, no matter how God moves, he always moves to heal and restore. And like that woman, we begin by responding to his call. We come to Jesus to be touched by him, to be emptied of our brokenness, and to be filled with His grace and love and life. Charlotte, the young woman, she's in the prime of her life. When tragedy struck her, forever changing the course of her life. It was a disease that just left her debilitated and weak and in constant pain, unable to do even some of the most basic tasks in life. She was an invalid. One day healthy, the next in this other life. She sank into a deep depression as her fair weather friends, I think we could put it that way, just stopped hanging out with her because she was no longer as much fun as she used to be. She felt more and more trapped in her home because she was unable to leave for any length of time without extreme weakness or this incredible pain that would rack her body. While she'd grown up in a Christian home, there'd never really been any kind of personal relationship between her and Jesus. Right? She'd grown up in church. She knew the truth about Jesus. She just never made a personal commitment. Now, with this disease hitting her life, she just really wrestled with anger and bitterness towards God. I think we kind of get that. We've been there. She just didn't understand why this was happening to her. Why her life had been so violently and so quickly just ripped away from her. And like the woman Jesus met that day so long ago in that synagogue, Charlotte was bent and broken and just felt useless. One day, her pastor came to visit her. Charlotte was really not in the mood for a visit, so she decided it was time to vent. And she just let it go. And she just let this pastor have all of the anger and bitterness that was so bottled up inside of her. When she kind of finished her tirade, the pastor just sat there for a moment. He said, "Charlotte, you need to turn your life over to Jesus." And with that, he prayed with her and left the home. Man, she resented what she thought was just his uncaring attitude. And she just wrestled with what he had said to her. But a few weeks later, she called him up and said, "Pastor, I know I need to turn to Jesus. But I feel that I've just got to somehow clean up this broken mess in my life. I'm so full of anger and bitterness and questions and doubt, and I just don't know what I'm supposed to do." And her pastor responded to her by telling her, "You just need to come to God just as you are." And so that's what she did. Those words spoken to her by her pastor stayed with her through the ups and the downs of life from that day forward. In her greatest moments, when she was feeling pretty good, she would come to Jesus just as she was, and she would worship him. And in her moments of despair, when pain and weakness would rack her body and the questions would just form in her mind again, why is this happening to me? You know what? She would just come to Jesus just as she was. Years later, she put those words into a song. The third verse, she says, more than any other, captures her story. It's the story of a broken person responding to the call of Jesus. You've probably heard these words before. "Just as I am, though tossed about with many a conflict and many a doubt, there's fightings and fears within and without. The whole Lamb of God, I come. I come." I don't know what brokenness you might be wrestling with today. But I do know that broken is something that we all face. But the greater truth I want you to hear is this, that there is a Jesus that we belong to who wants to heal you and restore you and make you whole. He still sees you. He knows what's going on. Man, he wants to help you. He's calling you to take that step of faith to come to him because he just wants to touch you. Not just maybe the surface issue, though he definitely addresses that. But he really wants to go deeper to where you're broken inside so that he can heal you and restore you. But he waits for us to respond. So if you sense him calling to you today, I just want to encourage you to come to him just as you are. To be emptied of your brokenness. Just give it to Jesus. And be filled today in a fuller way with his grace, his love, and his life.